people organizing in the news the last few weeks. But we also know that young people have always been on the forefront of organizing for justice and equality. But in the 1990s, a new kind of youth organizing started to grow. These groups were influenced by public policy attacks on young people of color, the rise of positive youth development, and several different community organizing models. So a new wave of organizing groups was born that combined community organizing and youth development and organized young people often around issues that were specific to young people themselves. So if you look at the youth organizing landscape map that's on the FCYO website, and if you haven't checked that out before, I highly encourage you to sign up for a profile and check it out. You'll see that there are now more than 300 organizations across the country that are doing this work. And these are groups that are organizing low-income young people and young people of color for the most part, that are mainly focused on middle school and high school students, though many also work with 18 to 24-year-olds as well. They organize around a range of different issues. Most common are education, immigration, juvenile justice, and health. The thing that we want to talk about on this webinar is that when a lot of people think about youth organizing, they think about protesting. They think about young people in the streets. They may think also about some of the policy changes that young people are achieving at the community level. And these are all important, but they don't tell the whole story. In recent years, more and more youth organizers have started incorporating a range of different supports into their work. In particular, groups have been offering academic support and social and emotional support. But in addition to that, there are tremendous skills that young people learn just through the process of organizing young people to take collective action in their communities. The result of all this is that youth organizing has become one of the most effective ways to support the holistic development of young people. For a while, we had anecdotal evidence. We had stories that we could tell about particular young people that had been supported in this way, but we didn't have a whole lot of research. In the last few years, there has started to be more research to back up this point. And so we put together this report to try to summarize some of the latest research. It's our contention that we now have the data to demonstrate that youth organizing is in fact one of the most effective ways to support the holistic development, particularly for low-income young people and young people of color. And we can point to several different reasons why this is true. First, youth organizing reaches those who are most impacted by inequity. By attending to the lived cultural experiences of young people of color, while also providing inviting spaces for youth, youth organizing groups reach the most marginalized young people. Second, youth organizing helps develop healthy identities. As we know, young people of color receive constant negative messages about themselves and their communities, right at the time when their self-identities are forming. Discovering their own power helps to shift their sense of self, their expectations for their futures, and their sense of the possible roles that they can play in the world. Third, involvement in organizing helps young people feel a sense of agency about their lives, the belief that they have control over their actions and can make a difference in the world around them that we know is so critical at this stage. Fourth, the research linking youth organizing practices to the development of core social and emotional learning competencies, and we're going to talk a lot more about that on this webinar, is particularly important in this moment. Fifth, the development of critical consciousness and collective agency. So through their involvement in organizing, young people begin to understand the systemic nature of problems in their communities and schools and the need for systemic solutions. Understanding the root causes of inequity is critical to healthy development for marginalized young people. And sixth, youth organizing supports simultaneous individual and community transformation. Addressing the conditions impacting young people requires individual healing and also altering structural inequities. Youth organizing supports these two types of change to happen at the same time. Individual and community level changes fuel each other and create a cycle of lasting transformation. So I now want to provide a little bit of overview of what's going to happen on this webinar. We have some really exciting researchers and youth organizers who are going to be on. First, we're going to hear from Dr. Veronica Terriquez of the University UC Santa Cruz. Our new report highlights two studies that she's conducted, one which surveyed nearly 1,400 youth from the California Endowment's Building Healthy Communities program, and another that followed 400 youth organizing alums. Then we're going to hear from Rossmery Zayas, a former youth leader and current youth organizer at Communities for a Better Environment in LA, about how this work has impacted her. After that, we're going to hear from Dr. Rod Watts and Dr. Ben Kirshner about an international study funded by Atlantic Philanthropies, examining youth organizing as a vehicle for civic engagement in South Africa, Ireland, and the United States. At the end, I'll come back and share some of the recommendations that we developed in this report. Also, at the end, we're going to take a moment to share a little bit about a new fund that FCYO has just launched to support youth organizing groups that are engaging in the current moment around gun control and school safety, with a perspective towards racial equity and long-term power building. So with that, I now want to, we will take questions. All right, we will take questions. We'll stop at a couple of points for Q&A. If people have questions throughout, there's a Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen, and you can put your questions there in the Q&A tab. So we'll stop at a couple points along the way. So with that, I now want to introduce our first speaker. Veronica Terriquez is an associate professor of sociology at UC Santa Cruz. She has a PhD in sociology from UCLA. Her research examines how individuals' demographic characteristics, as well as their ties to civic organizations, schools, and other reproduce or challenge social inequity. A lot of her research has implications for policies affecting low-income immigrant and Latino communities, and she also has prior experience as a youth organizer and volunteer with a number of different kinds of organizations and campaigns. So with that, I will turn it over to Veronica. You may still be muted, Veronica.
Okay.
Got it.
All right, great. Thank you, everybody, for joining the webinar, and thank you, Eric, for this introduction. Today, I'm going to share with you the results of two pretty comprehensive large-scale studies. And these studies draw on a large body of data to show that youth organizing can have an impact on young people's personal development, it can have an impact on families, and it can have impact on communities. Okay, trying to switch the screen here. Okay, great. So drawing on the two large data sets that I've collected since 2011, I've been able to publish a number of peer-reviewed articles that really show the impact of youth organizing at the individual, family, and community levels. At the individual level, my co-authors and I have shown that this intensive intervention has fostered high rates of college enrollment, as well as retention among low-income young people of color. The research also shows that young people who participate in youth organizing as adolescents continue to exercise high levels of civic leadership once they transition to adulthood. And then the work has also shown that in more recent years, young people are learning practices to heal from trauma, and they're learning how to take better care of their well-being and health. As I mentioned before, youth organizing has also had an impact on civic participation of entire families. compared to other young people in their communities, those who participate in youth organizing disproportionately educate their parents, their siblings, and sometimes their extended family members about what's going on in the community, and also engage them in local campaigns, and sometimes voting when eligible. And as you might expect, youth organizing has had important societal and community impacts. Not only have young people led policy change and helped the governments local governments be more accountable to the community, they've also contributed in narrative change around education issues, environmental justice issues, health equity, immigrant rights, and LGBTQ rights. Thanks to the generous support of the California Endowment, I'm currently leading an ongoing study that is tracking the youth development and health outcomes of members of organizing and youth leadership groups across the state of California. The study has included multiple waves of surveys of staff and young people, as well as interviews and participant observations. This work builds on an earlier study conducted back in 2011, where John Rogers and I surveyed a representative sample of young people across the state of California, as well as alumni of youth organizing groups, along with participants of the DREAM movement in the state of California. So overall, combined, this large body of data has kind of demonstrated that youth organizing can lead to a range of different youth development outcomes. And I've identified 4 key things that capture the different ways in which youth organizing affects how young people grow and learn. First, grassroots organizing develops members' basic civic skills. You learn how to run meetings, speak in public, plan activities for others. Now, young people learn these basic civic skills not just in youth organizing, but also in other groups like community service groups or student government or student clubs. But what starts setting youth organizing apart from other youth leadership groups is that it tends to offer a critical civics education that often makes academic learning that goes on in the classroom a bit more relevant. And in fact, some young people develop skills that they're not learning in the classroom, and they get exposed to civics curriculum that isn't part of the regular social studies curriculum. For example, young people learn to analyze the root causes of community problems. They learn to analyze social policies, and very importantly in this day and age, is that they learn how to understand the experiences of diverse members of their communities, whether it's people from different racial or ethnic groups, from immigrant groups, or from LGBTQ backgrounds. And then often using participatory action research methods, young people learn how to collect surveys, analyze surveys, write op-ed pieces, and produce social media that all further enhances their academic skills. And then, importantly, it provides young people with guided experience with civic action. So with the support of adult mentors, of youth organizing staff, young people learn how to implement campaigns. They learn how to navigate institutions. They learn how to lobby elected officials, organize protests, collect petitions, and in some cases, educate and mobilize voters. And then this is particularly important because for youth development, so this is what sets apart youth organizing from adult organizing, is that there's a particular attention to the developmental needs of young people. And increasingly, young people are acquiring strategies for healing from trauma. They're learning how to take care of their health and their well-being. And groups, for a while now, have been supporting the academic achievement of their members, encouraging them to go to college, or in some cases finish high school, and have supported their professional growth. Now, when I share this information with youth organizing groups, organizers often say, oh, that's right, we do all that. We really do all do that work. And oftentimes organizers are focused on campaigns that they don't necessarily take stock of all the important work that they do to develop young people's leadership skills and develop their well-being, support their well-being and academic achievement. And many times organizers anecdotally can speak to how they've supported their members in finishing high school and going to college. But they haven't necessarily taken stock of the extent to which their work has impacted the academic achievement of their members. So research conducted by John Rogers at UCLA and I has found that youth organizing is correlated with high levels of four-year college enrollment among young people who participate in these groups. So in this chart that I'm showing you here, the findings show the predicted probabilities of going to a community college, a state college such as Cal State LA or other similarly ranked institutions, the predicted probabilities of going to, as well as the predicted probabilities of going to a four-year college such as the University of California system school or an Ivy League. Here, the general population, or the representative sample of young people, is represented by the yellow bars, and the youth organizing alumni are represented by brown bars. The findings here show that the likelihood of going to a state school or a similar college is 26% for somebody from the general population of California residents. But this estimate goes up to 41% for somebody who participated in youth organizing while in high school. The differences are more striking for enrollment in selective universities. So the findings seem to suggest that participating in youth organizing significantly enhances the likelihood of going to the University of California or an Ivy League. So here, about 6% of the general population of California residents ends up going to UC or other selective college. Meanwhile, in our study, we found that 21% of our study participants were likely to end up in a selective four-year university. So what helps explain these academic outcomes? So in a book chapter recently published by Harvard Education Press, John Rogers and I argue that youth organizing represents a site for quality learning time. First, campaign efforts enhance student skills and expand their intellectual interests. For example, students develop their academic skills as they conduct community-based research, learn about local policies, and produce written or social media material to advance their campaigns. Second, many of the youth organizing groups in our studies offer direct academic support and college guidance. And one thing to note is that youth organizing often attracts a number of students who are struggling in school, not just high achievers. Special attention is sometimes paid to the students who have disciplinary records or sometimes are distracted from going to class. And one thing that often inspires young people to pursue a higher education is the staff, who tend to come from the same communities or similar communities as many of the young members. And then finally, youth organizing inspires members to see a connection between college attendance and a broader community empowerment agenda. Groups often teach young people that going to college is not just about individual success, but also about obtaining the tools to further uplift their community. And then finally, youth organizing, as you might expect, is associated with high levels of civic participation in adulthood. So in one study I conducted, I compared young people who had participated in student government while they were in high school to the alumni of youth organizing groups. And what I found was that the youth organizing alumni were more likely to be involved in their community, they were more likely to volunteer, and at the same time, they were more likely to be in charge of initiating or leading community improvement efforts. perhaps the case of the undocumented youth movement back in 2001 to 2002 best evidences the power of youth organizing to shape the leadership capacity of young people. In my research that focused on the undocumented youth movement back in 2011 and 2012, I found that many of the leaders of this movement learned how to organize while they were in high school, while they were members of youth organizing groups. For example, some of the young people that we interviewed talked about how they learned how to organize from being involved in an education justice group, an environmental justice group, or in groups that focus on health equity. So these localized campaign experiences prepared young people to lead a national movement. I think I'm out of time here, but I look forward to receiving questions from you about the information I presented here or the broader studies. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Veronica. And we'll take questions for Veronica in just a moment. I see a few that have come in already in the Q&A tab. So again, if you have questions for Veronica, you can start putting them in the Q&A tab and we'll come back to her in just a minute. But before we do that, we really wanted to make sure that on this webinar, we also heard from some of the young people that have been directly involved in leading this work. So with that, I want to introduce Rossmery Zayas. She's a youth organizer and communications intern at Communities for a Better Environment in Los Angeles. At CBE, she works specifically with the youth division. She became involved with the organization at the age of 14, and as an environmental justice advocate, she's worked on several campaigns, including one to push out toxic facilities that were contaminating their neighborhood, and another challenging expansion of a freeway. So with that, I will turn it over to Rossmery. Let's see, Rossmery, let's make sure we can see and hear you. Rossmery, you'll just need to unmute yours. There we go. Yes. All right. Can we hear you now?
There we go.
There we go. We got you.
Hi,
Great.
Well, yeah, first of all, sorry about that. Go for it.
No, I was just going to say, welcome. Thanks a lot for making this time to talk with us. So I guess maybe we just wanted to sort of start out this conversation by tell us a little bit about how did you get involved? What was going on in your life at that time, and what has kept you engaged?
Well, yeah, first of all, I want to thank all of y'all for inviting me to participate in this webinar, and it's just a huge thank you for everyone tuning in. But yeah, I became involved with Youth for Environmental Justice, the youth component of CBE, when I was about 14 years old. I was slightly familiar with the work that CBE did because my older sisters were involved with the organization, but I did not know, much about what the work they were doing. I simply just knew they went to these meetings. But in all honesty, I started going on my own to weekly meetings because of the pizza. And that's something I joke around with a lot of the members today, because in a way we're reeled in with this pizza, but at the end of the day, it was much more bigger than that. I learned a lot from the members, including myself, and this was, we kind of started shifting into conversation. So actually just from, starting with the slice of pizza, we started to learn that this was actually a way for a lot of our members to have a meal for the day. It was a way for a lot of our members to avoid problems at home. It was a way, I know in my own personal experience, for me to escape the alcoholism and drug abuse I would encounter on a day-to-day basis. So this was a lot of heavy stuff, and I didn't reflect on that until, I was in this space, eating with these other group of folks, and that's something that I really had to heavily reflect on. And I did have a lot going on in my life, being raised by a single mother, having 12 siblings, and feeling like I was the only person with these issues. But yeah, as I started to develop relationships with other youth members in the space, we became more comfortable in sharing our experiences and our problems. And we were able to make personal connections to those problems. And we were able to identify that, yeah, they were not individual problems. And we developed a critical consciousness of the root cause of community struggles. And it's funny enough, this all started for me just coming to these meetings for the food, but at the end of the day, it developed into something more serious. And ultimately, that's really what kept me engaged in coming to this space as someone who was in high school, as a ninth grader who was also involved with extracurricular activities, with sports and all of those other things. So yeah, definitely being able to make those connections really kept me engaged in the space because I was really able to make a personal connection to the organization.
That's great. I think many of the youth organizers can relate to you on people who came at first for the pizza and stayed then for other reasons. So tell us a little bit more about like what's a significant campaign that you worked on as a youth organizer?
Yeah, so one of the first campaigns I actually became involved with was XI Technologies, which is a lead battery recycling company. I remember feeling intimidated because we were high school students challenging a multi-billion-dollar facility that basically did what they wanted. EPA fined them up to $500 million for not complying with applicable air emission standards, releasing, they also released toxins into our aside from the air, to our water and soil because of broken pipe systems. So that was really something I had to really reflect on. And, this were simply fines that they were able to pay off because they are a multi-billion-dollar company. And also keeping in mind that the Department of Toxic Substance Control and the South Coast Air Quality Management District failed to regulate them. And this went on for about 3 decades. And we also discovered that XI contaminated about 10,000 homes with lead and roughly 90,000 people, residents and community members. So if this company was literally putting our lives on the line for profit and we're not listening to government agencies, then why would they listen to a bunch of high school kids? And I think that's a mentality I kind of came in with when I started to get involved with youth organizing, kind of feeling like I was a young person and like, why would these adults listen to me, especially as someone who, was barely taking classes like in math and maybe history, very typical things. But this campaign is significant to me because I was able to challenge that perspective. So in Southeast Los Angeles, we live with Superfund sites, rendering plants, economically influential oil companies, EPA-listed air polluters, and diesel truck pollution coming from the thousands of trucks that come in and out of the ports of LA and Long Beach. And like with that being said, I thought that living in such close proximity to places like XI was really normal. It's nothing new to us. I mean, even now where I live not too far from a few facilities that recycle some metals and some other things. But yeah, this is what our communities look like. And I kind of had the mentality that it couldn't look any different. But although we were marginalized communities, CBE definitely has helped me recognize that as a young person and as a woman of color, no one was going to come, fight for us or save me. We're not trees or wells. This was work that we had to do on our own. We had to organize because at the end of the day, this is our livelihood. So while our parents were at work, and although we had extracurricular activities, I know thinking back, reflecting now in 9th grade, I was in softball, I was president of like 3 clubs, I was involved in a lot of other things, and also community service clubs. But what's so significant about spaces like this, was the fact that, okay, I knew that I wasn't just doing this to put it on like a college application. At the end of the day, this was work I was doing because it mattered to me, to the well-being of my 12 siblings, to the well-being of my neighbors, and to the well-being of my community. Until this day, that's still the mentality I have doing this type of work. And with all of that being said, back in regards to XI, while all of that was going on, we were actually able to organize together, to do marches, to do die-ins, to do protests. And like Eric mentioned, it goes way beyond that. Youth organizing doesn't just look like protests. We had to do a lot of classroom presentations, workshops, education in the community, explaining like, hey, this is the case, this is the problem, this is what we're going to do about it. And this is how we have to organize, because otherwise things won't get done. And with that being said, in March of 2015, it was youth that shut down XI Technologies. We were the ones who got them to shut down, and beyond that, it did not just end there. The skills we developed as leaders also helped us hold those responsible, accountable. So to this day, I mean, it's a battle that we're still fighting. I started with this campaign when I was 14 years old. I'm now 21. So at some point I was in 9th grade doing this, and now I'm about to graduate from Cal State LA and still holding these type of workshops. So this is work I've been doing for a really long time, and that's something that kind of follows you. So yeah, back to that question, I mean, this is a very significant campaign that I worked on as a youth organizer, because it really developed me as a person, and it shaped the career path I'm heading on, and like the work I'm doing today.
That's great. So that's really, really exciting campaign. And there was, you're probably not reading the chat while you're talking, but there was definitely some love being expressed for you as you, while you were talking. So tell us now, it's great to hear the story of that campaign. Tell us now a little bit more about how the impact that this work had on you. So how did your organization support you, and how did being involved in this work, what impact has that had on you in your life?
So it was kind of funny because when you had asked me that question, I had to reflect a lot. I mean, I've been involved in this space for about 6 years, and I've been at weird levels of development. So, I mean, I've never really, I think, had the time to think about those kind of questions because I'm so focused like on these campaigns. And I know that's something Veronica mentioned in her research, was the fact that we're so focused on the actual work that is really important to our livelihoods that we don't even recognize, I think, the other aspects we're getting in terms of leadership development from like these organizations. But yeah, just to share like one clear example of that, as I progressed in my involvement with CBE, I was able to grow as a youth leader. One particular example that comes to mind is the work I did in Paris during COP21 back in 2015. So I shifted from this really shy person who was not confident in speaking to others to a representative of a statewide nonprofit organization with the membership of thousands of people and thousands of community members. And although at this point, although I did have a lot of experience organizing, I still didn't believe that I was the person to talk about climate change. I always felt like I didn't know the terms well enough or the facts confidently enough to speak to others about them. And that's really something I believe that held me back. But CBE supported me the entire step of the way. And I think something that was really valuable to me was that they trusted me to handle something so heavy. At the time, I wasn't a staff member. I was never an intern at the time. I was still in high school, or I actually had recently left high school. And I was at a place where I was like, there's so many staff members you can send, older folks who are maybe more experienced and who could probably handle that. But they wanted a young person to go because they believed in like the young people in the space and the power of youth organizing. So, you know, they reminded me how much I do know, you know, how much I know that my community suffers. They reminded me that I am an expert on my own experience. And they made clear to me that in order to support me as a young person, they also had to support me becoming a youth organizer, because those two go hand in hand. And I'll never forget, I mean, the photo on the screen, that's me standing on the street in Paris where we held our press conference, and the amount of emotion that took over. I think the most important lesson that CBE has taught me was that this is not just hard work, it's hard work. And in communities like mine, there is little access to leadership opportunities to do this type of work through traditional school-based programs. So being able to really do this type of work with an organization who valued me as a young person, and who really saw, you know, not just me, a young person, but like me as the woman and as a woman of color, and really being able to see my whole entire like identities, that really shaped who I was as a person, and also how I saw myself. And it really pushed a lot of motivation and confidence in the work that I did, because ultimately it's reiterating the fact that, you know, we're not just coming here to put it on a college application. Members don't dedicate like 10 hours a week, unpaid work, doing this, you know, for no reason. Like, this is our livelihood, and like we're doing it because no one else is going to do this work for us. So yeah, now I'm 21 years old. I am at a different level of development today compared to my 14-year-old self, and my involvement with youth organizing has inspired me to study communications with an emphasis on social change and rhetoric, so that I can use my education as a tool to create change. Now, as I'm approaching graduation, I've applied to grad school, and I'm still looking to do social activism work and community organizing, because as I reflected, I realized that all of my academic inquiries are reflective of my community organizing, and those two go hand in hand. And like the discussions I have in the classroom go beyond the book. They plug back into like what's going on now, and the problems we're facing as a community.
That's great. Thank you so much for sharing all that. And again, lots more love for you being expressed in the chat there. So yeah, really appreciate you being on to share all of that with us. So let's take a couple of minutes to see if people have questions for either Veronica or Rossmery. And you can put your questions in the Q&A tab. And I will try to get as many of them as I can to our speakers. So I think one question here that I think is probably sort of geared towards you, Veronica, although Rossmery, you might have something to say about this too. There's a lot of folks that are trying to figure out, that are, I think, are from youth organizers that are talking about how do they do the surveys with their members. What are the kinds of questions you ask? How does it align with the work that the young people are doing? So do you have recommendations, Veronica, or either of you, for what kinds of surveys that you do and how you track this kind of information in youth organizing groups? Are you there, Veronica? Let's see.
So the FCYO report lists a lot of the questions or a lot of the indicators that help track or measure well-being, youth development, academic support. I'm happy to share the surveys that I've used, and let's see, I can also share additional reports that may have other indicators of youth development and youth outcomes.
Right. I think another question that comes up a lot, and I'm curious both of your experience with this. I mean, Veronica, the findings that you put out are pretty remarkable. And then I think some people look at that and they'll say, well, all right, so did those young people, who are the young people that when they started out, right? Like, are we talking about people that really were on a college track already, you know, like, so I'm curious to have both of you sort of respond to this question, right? Like in your experience, are the young people that are involved in youth organizing, are these people that really were going to go to college already? And so, you know, like, is it sort of a self-selection issue, or, you know, who are the folks that are involved in these organizations, you know, from both of you?
So, and we surveyed young people, asking them why they get involved, and actually a lot of people survey responses reflect Rossmery's experience. One top reason that people join youth organizing is because there's free food or because it's fun. It's often a social space. Youth culture and art is often used to attract young people and also educate them. That's not to say that there aren't some young people who are already academically high achievers, not involved in youth organizing. So there's a mix of young people, but unlike, let's say, student government or maybe community service, youth organizing tends to attract young people who are most affected by the problems that the group is trying to address. So whether it's school discipline, whether it's environmental justice, whether it's immigrant rights, it attracts young people who are most affected by the local community problems. And those are not necessarily the highest achieving students.
Rossmery, what's your experience with that? Like in you know, like, are the young people that you draw into your organization, are they people who are already sort of like successful academically and sort of doing okay, or what, you know?
I'm also lost. No, actually, in my own experience, a lot of us, yeah, as mentioned, become involved with these spaces. Honestly, because it's a space away from a lot of other things. And we don't really come in with that mentality, but I think that's something we develop in the space. So I know we've actually had youth or organizers in our space actually created, there's actually a specific conversation we had at some point around that. So members created something like a workshop called Life After High School, where we invited like alumni and folks to kind of have this conversation. And we really talked about the impact of CBE in our experience and where we kind of ended up. So a lot of members even talked about the fact that like those who were not able to kind of pursue like going to school or college had a lot to do with them being like undocumented or not having the funds or having to work or not being able to do those things. And those who were fortunate enough to be able to come into this space and really take on those skills and use that to put in their college applications. And like we're fortunate enough that that was the case. So yeah, I don't think a lot of us came in. I mean, I didn't come in with the mentality of going to college to pursue communications, like to earn my AA, a bachelor's, and like a BA. Well, and a master's. So, I mean, that's something I didn't think about until I was in this space. So yeah, definitely. I think that youth organizing spaces really, the key thing there is they have you reflect on where you are as a person and how you plug into more systematic struggles and like what you can do to kind of challenge those things. So I know now we actually have a lot of youth members, most all of them pursue a post-secondary education. We actually have a member going to Harvard this upcoming school semester in the fall. And the reason they're going was, you know, aside from saying I can make it, like they really want to plug in, step out of our bubble, like in LA, and really like expand and learn from other spaces and like really bring into the space like what we know as youth organizers. So yeah, we have hundreds of high school age youth members, and they're all over the at this point the US. Yeah, there are so many places, a few folks on the East Coast and a lot in California.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you both for sharing all that. We've got some other great questions, and we may have time for some more Q&A with you both at the end. But I also want to make sure that we get to our other speakers, our next set of speakers on here. So let me now introduce the next speakers. First, we have Ben Kirshner, who's a professor of educational psychology and learning sciences at the University of Colorado, Boulder. He got his PhD in psychological studies and education at Stanford. And his research examines how young people from marginalized communities interpret their socio-political contexts and learn to exercise collective political agency. And with him, we have Roderick Watts, who's a professor at the CUNY Graduate Center, got his PhD from the University of Maryland. And his three main areas of research and practice are youth socio-political development, African-American cultural and racial identity, and African-American men's development. So with that, I want to turn it over to Rod and Ben to tell us about the research that you've been doing, both in the US and internationally, and some of what you found.
Great. Thanks a lot, Eric. I'm going to get us started. This is Ben Kirshner at University of Colorado, Boulder. I'm going to share a screen with you. And can you hear me okay, Eric?
Yep. Loud and clear.
I can't see myself, so I hope I'm viewable, but if not, people can at least hear my voice, and that's what matters. So it's nice to be here, and thanks for allowing me to be on this panel. And it was really appreciated hearing from Rossmery as well as Veronica to hear about the research and your experiences doing youth organizing. So it's an honor to be part of the group. Quick context, because Rod and I both have a few things we want to say, and we want to be concise, but we're going to be speaking from a project that we call the International Youth Organizing Study, and I'm showing a map of where the sites were that were part of that study. Dr. Watts was the principal investigator, and I was co-PI, and I want to mention Rashida Govan and Jessica Fernandez, who were both senior researchers on the project, as well as supporters of this webinar also were sponsors for the research, as you can see at the bottom right hand of that slide. The one thing I just want to say is that this was a mixed method study, and so I'd say we anchored it in ethnographic fieldwork over multiple years, which involved observation of routine activities of these groups, as well as interviews with young people and staff. There were surveys asking about young people's experiences, and then we analyzed artifacts, newspapers. One of the strategies we used was to hire local ethnographers in these cities who had either existing relationships or really understood the socio-political context, so that we weren't doing that kind of parachuting in approach to research, but really understanding the local context and how that related to youth organizing. So if people have questions about our methods, certainly we could answer them offline or share some of the writing we've been doing. Let me go to a website. This is a little bit of a plug, just because we're not going to talk about all the studies, but we've developed a website that we're calling Powerful Youth, Powerful Communities, and you can see the link there. It's an ongoing site that we're updating periodically as we do more writing. But this highlights the fact that we focused on 3 broad outcome areas for young people who were part of these groups: critical thinking and analysis, community leadership and action, and social and emotional development. Now, today we were asked just to talk about a couple elements of our research. So in a few minutes, you'll hear Rod talk about social and emotional development in these organizations. And what I'm going to do is actually focus a bit more on the structure of youth organizing learning environments. So again, this is a bit of a teaser for our broader project. But I hope to complement some of what we heard already on the panel by just saying a few things about what our research team observed as we spent time in these spaces. And I'm someone who really finds learning and learning environments fascinating, and really have been interested for a long time in how we can tease apart or differentiate learning on one hand from schooling on the other, because oftentimes our assumptions about learning are very kind of either implicitly or explicitly kind of guided by experiences of formal schooling. But as we all know, wow, there's so much learning that we experience in these community settings, and we heard some of that from Rossmery. So I'm trying to kind of share some of what we saw systematically. Let me go ahead and just jump right into some of the elements we observed. So this is something that I don't think any of us should take for granted: positive and affirming relationships that recognize young people's dignity and humanity. I heard a little bit of that in your stories, Rossmery, just around being affirmed as an expert and having your identity affirmed as a leader within this group. But certainly this is something that I think, especially now, we can all talk about in our current political context, but historically this kind of dignity and humanity is so important in a kind of compelling developmental setting, particularly for young people who are experiencing racism or structural barriers such as documentation and citizenship. This also we might take for granted, but I really want to underscore the notion of learning about topics that are directly relevant to young people's lives, everyday lives and aspirations. Here too, I think we see this when we think about the kinds of campaigns students are working on, whether it's working to end the school to jail track, fighting for neighborhood schools where uncles and parents and grandparents had gone to school, and trying to hold the government accountable for promises they've made, whether it's around public schooling or other issues around environmental justice. Something that stood out to me as a scholar who's studied a lot of kinds of informal learning environments is the accelerated opportunities for leadership we see. There's not a long sort of waiting period before youth that kind of jump into roles as public speakers and taking responsibilities on for campaigns. So the work moves fast, and we had a lot of interviews with youth who would talk about the idea like, hey, I showed up, I was interested, a friend of mine told me about it, and then immediately I was practicing my public speaking, getting ready to meet with this public official, and like they really just right away brought me into the experience. And that was something that stood out to us. And then the last piece, and I'll dwell on this for a minute or two before turning things over to Rod, is this notion of cycles of preparation, practice, performance, and feedback. This is an effort for us to apply a way of thinking about learning in youth organizing that really, again, gets us away from some of the mental models we might have from school. And this work is definitely influenced by some other scholars, such as Milbury McLaughlin and Barbara Rogoff and Shirley Bryce Heath. But this is something that we were seeing in these youth organizing groups. So real briefly, we were observing these cycles of learning that could be different lengths of time. So it might be over the span of a week or two that youth are preparing for a meeting with the school district and the police to talk about data around disparities in policing in their schools. So they got to spend some time preparing for the issue by studying the data and really making sure they've got a sense of what the data are showing. Often we'd see youth rehearsing or practicing for those and kind of role-playing those so that they're ready for tough questions or ready for anything, condescending responses, hostile responses, maybe friendly responses, but they want to role-play and be ready to answer questions on their feet. And then there's the actual performance where there's the interaction that happens, which, as Rod could mention too, often is a real powerful moment. And actually, Rossmery, you talked about the emotion that came with kind of speaking in those public settings, and that was something that a lot of people told us about. And often a debrief where you'd reflect and get feedback and plan next steps as being a key part of that learning. So again, I just want to underscore that cycle could happen over the span of a week, but you could also use that same general idea of a learning cycle to think about a year or 2 years, because we were looking at campaigns that took many years, and some young people were there for the whole time, but a lot would kind of only be available for part of it, but they would experience these these experiences of learning both on a short term and a long term over time. So I'm going to turn it over to Rod now, and he's going to really talk a little bit more about the social and emotional dimensions. And I'm just going to really underscore as I turn it over to him that these learning cycles are infused throughout with attention to relationships, community, and belonging. And we really wanted to say something about the strong organizational culture. Back to you, Rod. I'm going to try to stop my screen share.
We're going to try to get the technology to work for us here. Okay. Let me know when you can see this. Then can you see this? The screen share?
Yep.
Okay. I'm not going to dwell on this side, but as Ben mentioned, we did a lot of field work on the ground, observing all these things we'll be talking about, as well as doing a few surveys. So this will be available to you if you want to look into these details. What I'm going to focus on is returning to the cycle that Ben began with, and looking at it from a social and emotional development perspective. And let me give a shout out to Rossmery, who was really amazing and in some ways kind of stole what little thunder I can bring to this place. Everything that she said and talked about, we saw many hundreds of young people would say some very similar things about their experience and the power of that work. And the times when it can feel a little bit intimidating, especially when you're asked to go up and speak in front of a large group of people and can point to all these other people you think can do a much better job. So what I want to do is give you a little sense of how, kind of drill down into what are some of the things that go on, the practices in these organizations that contribute to the kinds of outcomes that Rossmery has had in her life, but also many of the other young people that we've talked with over the years. So in preparation and rehearsals, they're important because in some ways they help young people to manage their anxiety, their nervousness about standing in front of people in powerful institutions like folks in their schools and people in local governments. So it gets them ready so they know, yeah, I'm going to be nervous, but I know this stuff. I have this stuff down cool. And again, when Rossmery talked about her experiences talking before people and wasn't sure if she really had the terminology straight, there's really a lot of preparation that goes on, and she wouldn't have been chosen unless she had the chops to get up there and to speak truth to power. So, but at the same time, there's some of the anxiety we saw in these two areas that are really important, and get young folks thinking and finding ways to deal with these issues. We call these emotional work, in that it gives them an opportunity to manage these difficult emotions like anger, anxiety, frustration, the other ones you see on the slides, and to begin to manage it, then focus them over time. Another is that we talked about that occurs as these cycles go on, and there's one after another for folks in these long-term efforts to engage in social change, is emotional endurance. Really believing that like life, doing work in community organizing is a marathon, and you have to stick with these campaigns. That, like the one in Chicago, ended up 3-4 years for them to restore money for school, for summer jobs for the young people. So maintaining the composure, realizing things are going to take a long time to actually manifest was one thing we heard over and over about young people is getting confident about themselves, knowing that they'll have a win, and sticking with tasks over the long term. The big things that often come are in performances, when young people are up there in front of people and talking, and often feeling very nervous. And a number of the young people spoke about being shy and never thought that they could stand in front of people, much less powerful people, much less people like in their schools who actually have control over their lives. But they learned that they had this preparation, the rehearsals, gave them that sense of confidence, and the wins that they experienced from these experiences gave them the self-confidence to know that, yes, it's a long battle, but we can win it. And one last thing I want to say before I get on to talking about this youth organizing culture that supports all this work more broadly is the reflection settings that they have for young people. So they have a chance to sit back and think a little bit about these performances they just gave, or these actions they gave out in the public. I'm going to read just one quote from you from our field notes in San Francisco about one of these reflection statements. The adult who was facilitating the group asked, were there any other thoughts about or impressions from the day they took the action? And a guy named Francisco added that he felt good that he was able to get up there and talk. He added that he felt good about himself. Roxana added, I had a part in this too. And even though she had spoken at other events, she still felt nervous to talk in front of old white people, as she described it. Karen asked her what made her feel nervous, another young woman in the group. And Roxana said that she knew that she had a lot of power, and it was hard, but it was hard for her to keep calm and communicate effectively about something that she cared about very much. And so this passion about the work that Rossmery talked about is very much a driving force for them and keeps them engaged and working over time in these works. The second thing I want to talk about briefly, I'm not going to read all this information here to your left because we got to move on. But I want to talk a little bit about this youth organization culture, youth organizing culture that sort of bubbled up as one of our findings. A very supportive culture that Rossmery made references to, that we found was related to a number of important outcome variables in our study. As I mentioned, it was a mixed method study, and so when you look at the diagram there on the right, you see the outcome variables that we looked at through our surveys, and we found that they were associated with the center survey, looking at youth organizing culture, and there's a real connection between all of these. Now, we're not saying that the organizing culture caused it directly, but we're saying the two were connected. And young people talk frequently about how the setting, the positive affirmation they got in the setting, the relationships that they developed, the fun that they had in that setting, made it a place that they could go to escape some of the things that were going on in their communities, but also build skills and knowledge about how to help their communities. So I was speaking fast, but I'm done now. I'm going to turn it back over to Ben.
Thanks, Rod. Yeah, so just to close, and then we want to have some time for Q&A, so I'll turn it back to Eric in a sec. But I think for us, as people have looked at these questions in different studies, I think we really want to underscore this. There's this notion of social justice connections to social emotional learning that I think are really important to make, and I think this group could make them. Sean Ginwright has written about healing justice, as have other educators and scholars. But seeing some of the emotional work tied to efforts to both make visible but also dismantle oppression was really powerful in this work, and that's some of the things that I think is a new area for us to think about as people who care about young people and care about youth political development. I really want to underscore as a takeaway point that these youth organizing groups are very intentional about the learning environment that's going on there. And there's things that that different groups have developed some different systems for really bringing in newcomers, really apprenticing young people into important roles. And the more we can make those visible and share those with each other, including across national contexts, I think will be really important. Ideas we learned from South Africa, ideas we learned from Belfast, Northern Ireland, ideas in New Orleans, Denver, San Francisco, et cetera. And then lastly, we really do think some of the attention to relationships and dignity, and again, linking a recognition of oppression with the efforts to develop agency and power to dismantle that, is something that we've got to think about how that translates and doesn't translate into other kinds of educational spaces, including schools. So I'll stop there because we want to have time for some closing comments and also Q&A. Thanks a lot, everybody.
That's great. Thank you both so much. So we have a couple of minutes for questions that people have for Rod and Ben. So if you have questions for them, you can use the Q&A tab to put them in there. One question that's coming up is, there's been so much talk recently about social and emotional learning. And lots of new research that sort of indicates that social and emotional learning capacities are the most, some of the best predictors of future success for young people. And I'm just curious what else you found about, how youth organizing groups help develop those social and emotional learning capacities, and if there are ways that youth organizing has additional contributions to the thoughts about what makes effective social emotional learning. Are there additional things that youth organizing has to offer beyond the ways that the traditional literature talks about social and emotional learning?
Rod, do you want to take that first, or do you want me to share a comment?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
There's a lot of different facets of it, Eric, and one thing that we did not look at and study, but that was going on and we learned about because we spent this time inside, was there's a lot of personal connections that are made between staff and the young people who get to know them well, who get to know their parents well, get to know what's going on at home. I think I remember Rossmery alluding to kind of escaping things that are going on at home, because there are many things both in the street and the home that affects these young people. So the informal counseling and support between staff and young people that goes on, even though they not seeing themselves as a traditional youth development organization or counseling agency, they do a lot of work around giving individual support. I think another place where it comes out that I didn't talk directly about, which is key to their practices, is there are a lot of exercises that are done around political and social issues and about issues of identity. And these really intentional practices are aimed at triggering some of their past experiences, discrimination and oppression, of triggering their experiences in school that they found difficult, of traumas they experienced from things going on in the street. So those exercises are really an important place with a lot of this, where this emotional material gets surfaced, where it gets connected to structural violence, and where young people get some insights and some support from their peers as well as adults on how to deal with this trauma.
That's great. That's really helpful. Another question that came in on the Q&A, and Veronica, you may also want to weigh in on this as well, but someone said, this seems to be a really high-level conversation, which there is absolutely a time and place for, but how do we make this information accessible to young people in a way that resonates with them so they can inform and lead this research in a more meaningful way? So I'm wondering, for the researchers on here, what experience have you had actually using this research and sharing it with young people and engaging them in the findings and learnings?
Veronica, you want to go take that first, and then?
You may be speaking, but muted, Veronica.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So the most recent study was conducted along with a team of youth researchers, high school seniors, as well as young adults who had recently kind of either finished or exited high school. And they helped me design the surveys and collect the data, and they were responsible for reporting back to their communities. So they really had, they really played a role in the data research design, data collection, as well as communicating the results to their respective groups and communities.
Yeah, and this is Ben, and I would just say I appreciate the question and the suggestion, and I think in some ways, at least speaking for myself, a lot of the focus of my communication and relationship building and interaction was with kind of frontline youth workers who were kind of slightly older, young people in their 20s maybe, who were directly working with youth. And I think in that context, we had some really productive conversations about how to, especially about what Rod was just talking about, which was these elements around healing and supporting youth when dealing with different kinds of trauma. I think that was something that both they brought to us, and we were also able to share back some of the strategies we were seeing across groups for that. Another one was just some of the different ways that groups, one of the interests that the youth workers had was how different groups kind of provide some historical education, like histories of different social movements, social justice movements around the world. And that was something that we found groups are really interested in, is kind of getting access to both information about social movements across the world, but also strategies and methods for teaching about those in really engaging, student-centered ways. But so that's kind of been a focus, at least from a practice point of view, of the relevance for practice for me.
Right. Let's see, there's another question here, which I think you all touched on, but the question is, where does trauma healing come into the learning cycle? Often working on these issues, learning about the structure of racial oppression brings up a lot of trauma. What did any of you see about how these groups are addressing trauma?
One thing I would say about this, and it gets to the youth organizing culture I mentioned earlier, and in our final report, we had this vignette from a young woman who did testimonies before her peers and the senior staff, where she talked about an unfair suspension that she had and how she was treated unfairly by the school administration, and brought her to tears. And so what we saw, or what the ethnographer saw that was really powerful, is how people came up to her, physically comforted her, said things out there to affirm her situation. She told her story. And this was a frequent practice we saw, where people would, there'd be time and space for them in these supportive settings, and part of the youth organizing culture, where they could talk about things that have come up in their lives, how it affected them, and show emotion, express emotion, and get positive emotion, positive support back from it. So that was a powerful thing for us to see, and to see as part of an ongoing practice for these organizations.
Yeah, and I'd just like to say, I think that's a really important question, and I would also just, as we think about this question of trauma, I would really want to try to be specific about different types of trauma, and some requiring real professional help, and sometimes group needs to do that, and other times it's a kind of a structural trauma that can be channeled through organizing. So I'd like to put in a word for just kind of specifying different types of trauma that might call for slightly different responses. But I think what the groups and I think groups tend to know their limits too, around how they can kind of channel experiences of injustice into a sense of solidarity with each other and agency, and where they may play more like a role of case management and like helping get access to other services. And that's another big role that takes up a lot of the time of staff in groups who are really trying to meet these kind of holistic needs of young people who are part of them, and is part of the work. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Go ahead, Veronica.
The other thing that happens is that some groups do healing circles, where young people share what's been going on with their lives, and kind of decompress and debrief, and kind of create a strong network of support. And I saw that Destiny Villa, who is from a group here in California called MIRPA, there's one group that's really good about being systematic about holding these healing circles and providing a safe space for young people to just share out what they're going through. Other things that I think are really helping promote self-care are things like time for meditation, time for deep breathing, time for stretching, and also recognizing that it's important not to burn out young people, to make sure that there's a balance between the campaign work, their school work, and also having fun. Their children, they're adolescents or they're young adults, and fun and joy is part of life and part of making sure that their well-being is supported.
Eric, just a real quick, I wanted to echo a comment, because earlier you asked about what we as a field have to offer to kind of the broader socio-emotional learning community and what maybe some of these youth organizing groups differently. And I'm hearing that in what Veronica is saying and what Rod is saying. And I want to specifically give an example around, healing circles or opportunities for even just a check-in where students are talking about experiences they've had in school. I've seen just that can be powerful because they start to see that an experience they've had as individuals turns out to be something that is widely shared across the group. And it helps people shift from kind of internalizing that problem or blaming themselves for a problem to kind of see something that's collective or shared. That's something I don't see as much in conventional SEL literature or curriculum. And I think is a really important practice of linking those kind of check-in experiences to a sense of solidarity and shifting the focus to maybe a problem that's wrong with a system versus an individual. I think there's an excessive burden on the individual in a lot of the conventional SEL work that I think is different in youth organizing.
That's great. Thanks for highlighting that. Yeah, one of the things I found really interesting in your research was the ways that youth organizing is contributing to social and emotional learning, and some of the ways that it actually goes beyond and offers some additional, right, particularly with the attention to the systemic. So thank you all for sharing all of that and for answering those questions. I want to start to move us on to the next part. Before we close out, I wanted to share a little bit of information about one additional upcoming study. Let's see. So there's a study that's being started now by the Metropolitan Center at NYU and the University of Michigan in Algorithm, and supported by the William T. Grant Foundation. And this study is going to follow 250 youth organizing participants for over 2 to 3 years to examine the relationships between youth organizing, critical consciousness, developmental competencies, and school engagement. And we think this is another really exciting study. If people are really interested in learning more about that, I put the email for Sarah McAllister at the Metropolitan Center at NYU there, and you can contact her to learn more about that study. So at this time, I want to share some of the recommendations that we developed as part of this report. So first, our first recommendation was to invest in youth organizing as a fundamental piece of a successful youth development strategy. We think that the research findings that we described here show that youth organizing is a highly effective strategy for supporting the holistic development, particularly for low-income young people and young people of color. It has potential to reach and develop young people that are just missed by some other approaches, and that it offers some additional benefits for engaging in organizing. So we think it's important for funders who care about youth development and social and emotional learning should invest in youth organizing as a proven strategy to support the development of young people that may be missed by other approaches. Our second recommendation is to invest in approaches that connect individual and community transformation. I think too often funders feel like you have to choose between individual and systemic change. But we know that real transformation comes from these things being done together. Youth organizing is a powerful strategy because it attends to the individual development while also creating systemic change. So in this way, youth organizing represents an investment with kind of a threefold impact. There's stronger individual youth development, increased leadership skills, and powerful youth-driven community social change. Our third recommendation is to expand the conceptual frameworks on youth development to incorporate aspects of youth organizing as essential components. The research here shows that engaging young people in collective action to create change in their communities offers long-term benefits that are especially relevant for low-income young people and young people of color. So we think that it's critical that we now shift the paradigm on youth development to recognize that taking collective action is a necessary and critical part of the healthy development of all young people. And finally, we believe that we should focus support on the groups that are committed to aligning their work with the recognized best practices in youth organizing. As youth organizing is growing and attracting more resources, more people are getting involved, and that's great. We think it's important for funders to focus their research on groups that are truly understanding the unique practices of youth organizing. So we hope that sharing some of these research findings has been useful in helping to share what some of the practices and impacts that youth organizing is having on the ground. We hope it's been useful to youth organizers in thinking about how you can talk about your work in a way that's aligned with what researchers and potentially some other types of funders in the way that they're describing work. I hope that people download the report and share it with their colleagues and funders. And if there's ways that we can continue to be helpful in using this research, please let us know. I want to shift gears here before we close out and let people know about this new fund that we're launching at FCYO. Like many of you, we witnessed the tragedy in Parkland, and we've been inspired by the moral leadership of those young people in response. We also know that at the same time, young people of color have been impacted by violence and have been organizing for a long time to address violence, and that we must ensure that the solutions that get put forward don't further criminalize communities of color. So we believe that in this moment, there's a powerful opportunity for us to build alliances across race and class and support a youth movement that addresses multiple forms of violence. So for that reason, FCYO is now launching the Youth for Safety and Justice Fund. It's a fund that will support young people that are engaging in this moment around gun control and safety in schools and communities, while paying attention to racial justice and an eye towards building long-term power and creating systemic change. So our goal is to raise $250,000 for rapid response grants that would support youth organizing groups that are engaging in this moment. And then beyond that, we want to raise an additional $1 million over the long term, because we know that there's a need for rapid response funding, but we also know that creating the kind of changes that we're talking about take time and take sustained work and investment. We've currently raised about $85,000 for this fund, and so we'd like to encourage other funders, individual donors, others to join us in supporting the critical ways that young people are organizing in this moment and this opportunity to build alliances across race and class for a really transformative moment. With that said, I want to thank everybody for joining this webinar. I want to thank all of the speakers for sharing all the research and the work that you've been doing. We really appreciate that. I want to thank our co-sponsors and the funders that helped support this research, and the others that helped co-sponsor this webinar. The final thing is that we do now have an evaluation of the webinar. We have a link that's going in the chat now. We would really appreciate it if people take a moment to complete the complete the evaluation, to let us know about these webinars. We want to improve them over time. I also, while you're filling out the evaluation link, you can see that Mona just added that link in the evaluation. Again, please give us some feedback. I also want to highlight the next webinar that we're doing. Whoops, I went too far. Hold on one second, sorry. Here it is. Our next webinar is going to be on March 15th, and is going to focus on youth organizing for power. That's at 3 p.m. Eastern on the 15th. At FCYO, we've been doing a lot of work to really think about the role of young people in building long-term meaningful power to transform communities. So that webinar, Hashim Benford from our staff will be facilitating and sharing a lot of the learnings that he's been developing as part of our Pipelines to Power cohort, and will also feature the work of El Pueblo in North Carolina and Oakland Kids First. So we hope people will join us for that. So again, I want to say thank you to all of our speakers and panelists and to the folks that help support this. And thank you to all of you who are joining. And if there are ways that we at FCYO can continue to support the organizers out there and the funders who'd like to get involved in supporting this work, please let us know. We're here to try to join with all of you to help build a strong, sustainable field that supports young people playing meaningful roles in social justice across the country. And if there's any ways that we can support you in doing that, please let us know. Again, thank you so much for joining, and we look forward to being in touch.